Hello students, this is AK from my bio classes and we are discussing gametogenesis. In this part, yesterday we discussed about spermatogenesis and today we are going to discuss oogenesis, the formation of matured female gamete.
Students, what is oogenesis? Oogenesis is the process of formation of mature ovum or mature female gamete. So the process of formation of mature female gamete or mature ovum is called oogenesis. Oogenesis or formation of ovum takes place in Graafian follicles. Oogenesis is initiated in embryonic stage of girl child when millions of egg mother cells or oogonia are formed within each ovary. So during this stage, a couple of million gamete mother cells or oogonia are formed in the fetal ovary. No more oogonia are formed or added after the birth of girl child in her ovaries. So whatever oogonia are formed before her birth. मतलब उसके बर्थ से पहले जितनी उगोनिया बने हैं उतनी ही उगोनिया रहेंगे उसके बर्थ के बाद भी, लेकिन वो मल्टीप्लाई हो करके दे विल फॉर्म प्राइमरी oocytes and these primary oocytes will enter into prophase 1 of the meiosis division and temporarily it gets arrested at that stage. उसी स्टेज में वो अरेस्ट रहेंगे टिल प्यूबर्टी. सो द oogonia form primary oocytes and this oogonia starts the process of meiosis and get arrested at the stage of prophase 1, and these cells originating from oogonia are called primary oocyte, which is arrested at prophase 1 of meiosis. Oogonia multiplies to form primary oocytes and primary oocytes undergoes meiosis 1 and it gets arrested at prophase 1 phase, and these primary oocytes there is surrounded by a layer of granulosa cells, and when it gets surrounded by a layer of granulosa cell, primary oocytes form primary follicles. You can see in this picture primary oocyte is there, and when it is surrounded by a layer of granulosa cell it becomes a primary follicles, and a large number of primary follicles are degenerated at the age of puberty after birth. So during the phase from birth of a girl child to her puberty, a large number of primary follicles are degenerated. You have seen millions of oogonia were formed in the fetal's ovary, in each ovary, but after birth, during the phase from her birth to her puberty, many or huge number of primary follicles degenerated. Only 60,000 to 80,000 primary follicles are left in each ovary at the age of her puberty, or you can say that at the age of 12 or 13 years when the first menstruation cycle starts. At that particular time, only 60 to 80,000 primary follicles are left in each ovary of a girl child. So this primary follicles gets more deposition of granulosa layer and it becomes secondary follicles, and this secondary follicles becomes tertiary follicles, and tertiary follicles are characterized by, it can be identified by what? A cavity of fluid. That cavity of fluid is called antrum. We will see here. This is primary oocytes and it gets a deposition of granulosa cell. So this structure is primary follicles. This structure is primary follicles. When a primary oocytes gets surrounded by a layer of granulosa cell, it becomes primary follicles, isn't it? Primary follicles. And these primary follicles gets more deposition of granulosa cells and it becomes a layer outside theca cells, and these structures is called secondary follicles. This is called secondary follicles. And when these secondary follicles gets more deposition of granulosa cells, a mass of granulosa cells, then the theca will be easily categorized outside as called theca externa, and inside it is called, inside the inner layer is called theca interna. Theca interna is the inner layer, inner theca, or outer theca is called theca externa, and there will be cavity formed in the follicles, and so tertiary follicle will be recognized with the presence of antrum. If antrum is present, then it is tertiary follicles, isn't it? And this will grow into a fully matured follicles. This is fully matured follicles are called Graafian follicles, and now this Graafian follicle will form ovum. And so far we have studied that how the development of ovarian follicle takes place. So this is the development of ovarian follicle. First it is primary follicles. Primary follicle is characterized by the presence of a layer of granulosa cell around primary oocyte, and then it changes into secondary follicle. This secondary follicle will have more number of layers of granulosa cells, and tertiary follicle will be categorized by the presence of antrum, a fluid filled cavity. And tertiary follicle will further grow and it becomes matured, fully matured, and the fully matured follicle is called Graafian follicle. Students, let us understand the ovarian follicle development by this picture. This is primary oocytes, and these primary oocytes are formed at embryonic stage, and these primary oocytes undergoes meiosis 1, but it is arrested at prophase 1 phase of the meiosis 1, and it gets the deposition of a layer of granulosa cell around it, and it becomes a primary follicles. And these primary follicles gets more deposition of more layers of granulosa cell, it becomes a secondary follicle, and this secondary follicle have two layers of granulosa cells. Outer will be called as theca externa and inner will be called as theca interna. And sometimes there is a fluid filled cavity is seen. If there is fluid filled cavity, then it will be called as tertiary follicle. This has a fluid filled cavity, so this will be called as tertiary follicles, isn't it? And then this tertiary follicle will mature into Graafian follicle. Matured follicles are called Graafian follicle, and this Graafian follicle stage में meiosis 1 gets completed and it becomes secondary oocyte. Here it was primary oocyte, and this in matured Graafian follicle meiosis 1 completes, but it is before ovulation. It completes and it forms a secondary oocyte, and this secondary oocyte comes out after rupture of Graafian follicle, and this release of ovum or secondary oocyte from Graafian follicle is called ovulation. It's called ovulation. Ovulation is the process of liberation of or release of ovum from Graafian follicle, ruptured Graafian follicle, and this ruptured Graafian follicle is called corpus luteum, and corpus luteum is the ruptured graphene follicle, but this ovum is secondary oocyte. As soon as this ovum gets entry of sperm, then it becomes ovum, and this becomes ovum. Here it is at this stage, this is secondary oocyte. This is secondary oocyte. But as soon as it gets entry of sperm, secondary oocytes completes meiosis 2, and we get an ovum and second polar body. And this ruptured graphene follicle are called corpus luteum, and when there is fertilization, then corpus luteum will produce a hormone called progesterone. But if fertilization has not occurred, then corpus luteum will degenerate, and this degenerated corpus luteum will be residue as a connective tissue, and this will be called as corpus albicans. And this process of degeneration of corpus luteum is called luteolysis. Luteolysis, isn't it?
Tertiary follicles grow in size, and it undergo first unequal meiotic division to form a large haploid secondary oocyte and a tiny first polar body. The secondary oocyte retains nutrient rich cytoplasm of primary oocyte, और जो primary oocytes में जो cytoplasm थे उस cytoplasm को secondary oocyte में भी मिल जाता है. ठीक है, तो in this way primary oocytes changes into secondary oocytes in Graafian follicles. It is unknown that whether the first polar body divides or degenerates. फर्स्ट पोलर बॉडी तो बनते हैं, एक सेकेंडरी oocytes बनते हैं, एक फर्स्ट पोलर बॉडी बनता है, बट फर्स्ट पोलर बॉडी का क्या होता है, व्हाट इज द फेट ऑफ पोलर बॉडी, इट इज स्टिल अनोन whether it further divides or it gets degenerated after its formation, isn't it? So tertiary follicle further changes into mature follicle, or this mature follicle is called Graafian follicle, as we have studied Graafian follicle. And secondary oocyte, you can see here, this is a cell that becomes corona radiata after ovulation. We will study about this. Secondary oocyte form a new membrane, this is called zona pellucida. अब secondary oocyte में एक लेयर यहाँ बनेगा और उस लेयर को कहेंगे zona pellucida. Graafian follicle now ruptures to release secondary oocyte. अब Graafian follicle rupture होगा, rupture होकर के this secondary oocyte will come out, and this is called ovulation. Let us summarize the process of oogenesis in a flowchart. Oogenesis begins with oogonia. Oogonia, egg mother cell. This is a diploid and it contains 46 chromosomes, and it multiplies by mitosis and it increases in number, and it becomes primary oocytes. Primary oocytes grow in size, and it gets deposition of a layer of granulosa cell around it, and it becomes primary follicles. And inside primary follicle, primary oocyte starts growing, and primary follicle will develop into secondary follicle with a deposition of more layer of granulosa cells, and secondary follicle will develop into tertiary follicle. Tertiary follicle will be characterized by the presence of antrum, and tertiary follicle will further grow into mature Graafian follicle, and mature Graafian follicle में meiosis 1 complete हो जाता है before ovulation, and Graafian follicle के अंदर जो primary oocytes है, that primary oocytes will undergo meiosis 1, and which was arrested in fetal stage,
before puberty, so it will be completed now just before ovulation. And जैसे ही meiosis 1 complete होगा, then Graafian follicle में primary oocyte will change into secondary oocytes, because meiosis 1 is the reductional division, and so this diploid cell will give rise to 2 haploid cells by meiosis 1, and there will be secondary oocyte, another haploid cell will be first polar body. So primary oocytes will undergo complete meiosis 1 and it gives rise secondary oocytes and a first polar body. What happens to the polar body? It is still unknown whether it survive or it gets degenerated. It is still a mystery. This secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis 2, it will complete meiosis 2 when there is entry of a sperm to the ovum. As soon as ovum wall, zona pellucida layer is broken by sperm, then meiosis 2 will be completed and secondary oocyte will give rise to an ovum and second polar body. Meiosis 2 will be as equivalent to mitosis, so haploid cell will give rise to haploid cells and one polar body will be, that also will be haploid. Ovum has 3 layers, 3 membranes: plasma membrane, the innermost layer; zona pellucida, that is just outside the plasma membrane, and this is very important layer because when a sperm enters to zona pellucida layer, it secondary oocyte completes the meiosis 2 and it changes into ovum, it gives rise to ovum. And one more layer is there, corona radiata. Corona radiata is the outer layer formed of follicle cells. This corona radiata is outer layer of cells, follicle cells. Difference between spermatogenesis and oogenesis, you will find that spermatogenesis occurs in testes and oogenesis occurs in ovary. Spermatogenesis has a limited growth phase, but here oogenesis has elaborated growth phase right from the embryonic stage to puberty stage and further on. Each primary spermatocyte will give rise to 4 sperms, लेकिन here in a primary oocyte will give only one ovum will be produced and other will be polar bodies. No polar body formation takes place here, but here polar bodies are formed. How many polar bodies are formed? 2 polar bodies are formed, and spermatogenesis begins at puberty and extends up to senility, but oogenesis begins at embryonic stage but suspends up to the age of puberty, up to the puberty. Puberty में ये stage suspends हो जाता है. It ceases around the age of 50 और 50 के एज तक आते आते oogenesis होना बंद हो जाता है, and that stage is known menopause. When first ovulation occurs, it is known as menarche, and when it ceases around the age of 50, it is called menopause stage.